Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Daphne stands at the fragile edge of a future she has fought hard to rebuild, a unborn represented by the marriage day she has planned with scrupulous care and quiet stopgap alongside Carter, a man who believes love should be simple, honest, and untouched by the murk of the history, yet those murk refuse to stay buried when the brewing presence of her ex-husband resurfaces with a revenge that feels both particular and theatrical, as though he has been staying patiently for the precise moment when happiness would be at its most vulnerable, and that moment is now, on the day meant to seal Daphne's new morning, a day wrapped in white fabric, soft music, and the pledge of ever, all of which he intends to tear apart thread by thread. Times agone, Daphne escaped a marriage that was simply unhappy but sharp, one erected on control, manipulation, and emotional warfare that left unnoticeable scars long after the legal documents were inked. And though she rebuilt herself, still, changing metropolises, habits, and indeed the way she allowed herself to smile, her ex-husband no way truly released his claim over the interpretation of her he believed belonged to him, a belief that disgruntled into preoccupation when he learned she was divorcing, not in secretiveness but openly, joyfully, daring to believe she could be loved without fear. Carter, ignorant of the depth of this history, enters the story as a man disarmed by Daphne's strength and gentleness, someone who sees her not as damaged or complicated but as flexible and good, and it's this veritably perception that infuriates the ex-husband most, because it invalidates the narrative he has cleaved to, the idea that Daphne is deficient without him, unable of happiness beyond his reach, and so he vows not simply to intrude the marriage but to annihilate it emotionally, to make the day synonymous with pain rather than festivity, a final act of dominance offered before substantiation's whole. Flashback Daphne's gashes more vividly than her promises. The trouble arrives not as a dramatic explosion but as a nipping tale, a communication that crawls under the skin, reminding Daphne that he knows the venue, the guest list, the timing, the small details she formerly participated in a different life when she believed closeness was safe, and each word is chosen precisely to destabilize her, to make her question whether she's venturing Carter simply by loving him, whether her history is a contagion that infects every future she dares to imagine. Carter, blindsided by the unforeseen emergence of this dark figure, struggles to attune the woman he knows with the fear he now sees in her eyes, and the script draws pressure from this gap in understanding, from the way love can be tested not by treason but by secrets kept for survival, secrets Daphne buried not out of dishonesty but out of a hopeless desire to eventually live without explaining her pain. Yet now the verity spills out under pressure, revealing a history of gaslighting, pitfalls disguised as affection, and a marriage that worked like a captivity with unnoticeable bars. As the marriage day approaches, the ex-husband's presence becomes universal, appearing in anonymous notes, unsettling phone calls, and coincidences too precise to ignore, each one tensing the cerebral mesh, while Daphne oscillates between defiance and terror, determined not to let him steal another corner yet visited by the possibility that standing her ground may bring Carter his sense of safety or indeed his life. And the script consummately explores this internal conflict, portraying Daphne not as a helpless victim but as a woman forced to defy the moping power of trauma, the way it resurfaces when you least anticipate it, demanding acknowledgement before it'll loosen its grip. Carter, meanwhile, undergoes his own metamorphosis, shifting from confusion to defensive resoluteness, scuffling with passions of inadequacy because he didn't see this coming, because he cannot simply fix it with consolation or love. And this helplessness threatens his confidence as a mate, pushing him to question whether love alone is enough to shield someone from a once determined to reclaim them. The ex-husband's oath to destroy the marriage isn't simply about Daphne but about spectacle, about reclaiming narrative control, and the script emphasizes his need to be seen, to have his pain and rage validated by the chaos he creates, situating him as a man who equates attention with actuality, whose identity has hollowed out so fully that ruining Daphne's happiness feels like the only way to prove he still matters. As the form nears, the pressure escalates into a cerebral chess match, with Daphne trying to anticipate his moves while refusing to retreat, determined that fear wouldn't mandate her choices presently. Indeed, as every instinct screams that the safest option would be to vanish, to cancel the marriage, to spare everyone the fallout, yet doing so would mean allowing him one final palm, attesting that he still controls the line of her life. The script's emotional core lies in the way it frames the marriage day itself as a battlefield between history and future, between the woman Daphne was forced to be and the woman she has chosen to come, with each step down the aisle emblematizing not just commitment to Carter but a public protestation that she has survived, that she'll no longer shrink to accommodate someone additional's darkness. When the ex-husband eventually reveals himself, whether physically or through a final, ruinous act designed to shatter the vision of safety, the moment is lower about shock and further about reckoning, about Daphne facing him not with the fear he expects but with clarity, exposing his pitfalls for what they are. The hopeless flailing of someone who cannot stand to be forgotten, and in doing so, she reclaims the narrative not just for herself but for Carter, whose faith in her strength deepens as he substantiates the cost of her survival. Carter's original blindsiding evolves into solidarity, as he recognizes that loving Daphne means standing with her in the fate of trauma, not demanding a sanitized interpretation of her story, and the script treats this consummation with nuance, admitting that support isn't heroic grandstanding but tolerance, hearkening, and the amenability to defy discomfort without retreat. By the time the promises are spoken, whether amid chaos or in a hard-won calm, the marriage day has converted into commodity more complex than a fairy tale ending, getting rather a testament to adaptability, a turn-down to let the worst chapters define the ending, and the ex-husband's attempt to destroy the day eventually exposes his own emptiness, differing sprucely with the wholeness of the life Daphne is erecting. The moping impact of the trouble doesn't evaporate neatly, and the script wisely avoids suggesting that one battle erases times of detriment, rather showing how mending is ongoing, how courage is frequently quiet and accretive, set up in the decision to keep choosing love indeed when fear insists else. And as the day closes, Daphne stands not as a woman saved by marriage but as a woman who has saved herself, with Carter not as a deliverer but as a mate who walks beside her, completely apprehensive of the darkness they've faced and the light they've chosen to cover, making the story not just about a marriage under siege but about the profound act of reclaiming joy from those who tried to weaponize love, a memorial that the history can knock loudly at the door, but it doesn't get to decide who we come unless we let it. In the fate of that day, after the music faded, the guests dispersed, and the precisely arranged flowers began to wilt under the weight of everything they had witnessed, Daphne discovered that survival doesn't end when the trouble retreats, that courage doesn't dissolve into relief simply because the worst moment has passed, because the mind, formerly trained by fear, continues to overlook the horizon for peril long after the adversary has stepped out of view, and this consummation settles into her sluggishly, in the quiet hours when the adrenaline drains down and leaves behind a strange emptiness where certainty used to be. The marriage, though eventually complete, becomes layered with meaning, no longer just a memory of promises and festivity but a cerebral corner dividing who Daphne was from who she's still getting, and this duality haunts her in unanticipated ways, similar as when she folds her dress down and feels both pride and grief, pride for standing her ground and grief for the innocence she no way truly had the chance to witness, because indeed in Palm there's loss, and the script doesn't wince down from this complexity, rather allowing the emotional residue to loiter like bank after a fire, unnoticeable but unmistakably present. Carter, now completely apprehensive of the magnitude of what Daphne endured before him, wrestles with his own reckoning, fating that love isn't a guard that retroactively erases detriment, and that his part isn't to overwrite her history but to attend with it, to make space for recollections he cannot change and hurt he didn't beget, a consummation that deepens his respect for Daphne but also humbles him, stripping away any vision that being a good mate means having answers, when in verity it frequently means permitting query and staying anyway. Daphne, for her part, begins to defy the subtle ways her ex-husband's influence still echoes through her studies, in moments of vacillation, in reflexive justifications, in the instinct to minimize her needs so as not to provoke conflict, and these discoveries are both painful and empowering, because naming them transforms them from silent masters into visible adversaries, and the script portrays this internal work with the same graveness as the external trouble, emphasizing that the most continuing battles are frequently the bones no bone differently can see. As days turn into weeks, the ex-husband's shadow doesn't evaporate fully but recedes into a distant hum, a memorial rather than an immediate peril, and Daphne learns that reclaiming her life isn't about forgetting him entirely but about reducing his presence from commodity that dictates her choices to commodity that no longer deserves her attention, a shift that requires deliberate trouble, remedy, honest exchanges, and moments of raw vulnerability where she admits that some injuries still pain indeed when they no longer bleed. Carter becomes an anchor during this process, not by asserting control or immolation empty assurances, but by hearkening without guard, by defying the appetite to fix what cannot be fixed, and by affirming through harmonious action that Daphne's fears are accessible without being ineluctable. And this immutability allows her to experiment with trust in ways she no way could ahead, testing the belief that closeness doesn't have to come at the cost of autonomy or safety. The script's durability deepens its disquisition of power by examining how Daphne's ex-husband, stripped of the response he craved, begins to unravel off-screen, his absence from the narrative growing louder than his presence ever was, suggesting that his true defeat lies not in discipline or exposure but in impertinence, a fate far more ruinous to someone who fed on control and attention. And this thematic choice reinforces the idea that mending isn't always dramatic, that occasionally it looks like moving on so fully that the antagonist becomes little further than a citation in someone additional story. Daphne's trip forward is marked by small, recalcitrant acts of normality, choosing a new routine, planning an unborn trip, laughing without incontinently surveying for consequences, and these moments, though quiet, carry immense weight because they signify a nervous system learning that joy doesn't automatically antecede disaster, that happiness can live without being incontinently penalized, and the script treats these incremental palms with reverence, understanding that for survivors of emotional abuse, peace can feel as radical as rebellion. Carter, observing these changes, learns to recalibrate his understanding of strength, realizing that Daphne's adaptability doesn't mean she's impregnable, and that recognizing her strength requires esteeming her limits, allowing her to set the pace of mending without pushing her towards some imagined finish line. And this collective recalibration becomes the foundation of their marriage, one erected not on idealized love but on informed concurrence, emotional knowledge, and the participated commitment to break cycles rather than repeat them. Yet the history doesn't vanish neatly, and the durability acknowledges this by introducing moments where Daphne is touched off suddenly, in a tone of voice, a locked door, an argument that escalates too snappily. And these moments test both her managing strategies and the couple's communication, forcing them to defy how fluently old patterns can resurface if left unexamined. And rather of portraying these lapses as failures, the script frames them as openings for deeper understanding, buttressing the communication that mending is nonlinear and that progress frequently involves circling back to assignments you allowed. You had formerly learned. The marriage, formerly stressed as an implicit disaster, gradationally transforms in Daphne's memory, not into a perfect day but into an important symbol of choice, a memorial that she chose herself indeed when fear suggested retreat, and this reframing becomes a foundation of her recovery, allowing her to draw strength from the memory rather than dread, and in doing so, she rewrites the emotional script that formerly mandated her responses, replacing ineluctability with agency. Carter's own growth continues as he reflects on the ways society frequently minimizes cerebral abuse, fading how fluently he, too, undervalued the soberness of what Daphne survived simply because the scars were unnoticeable, and this mindfulness energies a quiet advocacy within him, a determination to hear more nearly, to believe sooner, and to challenge narratives that equate abuse solely with physical violence. And while this elaboration is subtle, it underscores the broader counter-accusations of the story, extending its applicability beyond the central characters to the followership itself. As time passes, Daphne begins to reclaim corridor of herself she formerly suppressed, ambition, creativity, naturalness, traits that were formerly framed as arrears within her first marriage but are now embraced as strengths. And this recovery is portrayed not as an unforeseen awakening but as a gradational exhuming, each rediscovered piece buttressing her sense of identity independent of both her ex-husband and her part as a woman. And this independence doesn't hang her marriage to Carter but enriches it, proving that cooperation thrives when both individualities are whole rather than lowered. The script also interrogates the notion of check, rejecting the simplistic idea that defying one's abuser automatically resolves everything, rather suggesting that check is frequently tone-generated, set up in the decision to stop seeking confirmation from someone unable of furnishing it, and Daphne's acceptance of this verity marks a turning point, freeing her from the exhausting stopgap that one final discussion or explanation might ever rewrite the history. Carter supports this shift by esteeming Daphne's boundaries, understanding that mending doesn't bear reconsidering trauma endlessly, and this collective respect becomes a language of love more important than grand gestures, buttressing the script's commitment to literalism over psychodrama. As the durability draws toward its conclusion, the focus shifts decreasingly toward the future, not as a guaranteed safe haven but as an open geography shaped by conscious choice, and Daphne's growing confidence is apparent in the way she plans, dreams, and speaks about what comes next without automatically qualifying her expedience with fear, and while query remains, it no longer dominates, being rather as one variable among numerous rather than the defining force of her life. The ex-husband, once the central source of dread, fades into abstraction, his pitfalls rendered helpless by Daphne's turndown to acquaint her life around them, and this thematic resolution reinforces the story's ultimate assertion that while the history can wound deeply, it doesn't retain absolute authority over the present unless that authority is continually surrendered. In the final moments of the durability, Daphne reflects on the incongruity that her marriage day, formerly targeted for destruction, came the catalyst for profound tone recovery, forcing her to defy what she survived and affirm what she deserves. And this reflection isn't triumphant in a traditional sense but predicated, mature, and still bent, landing the substance of a woman who no longer needs her life to be perfect in order for it to be hers. Carter stands beside her, not as a rescuer but as a substantiation, someone who sees her completely and chooses her anyway, and together they embody the story's central verity that love, when stripped of vision, isn't about erasing darkness but about refusing to let it mandate the terms of your joy, and in this turndown lies the most important act of defiance, one that no trouble, no matter how advised or cruel, can eventually undo. As the seasons turn and the sharp intensity of that hovered marriage day softens into commodity less jagged, Daphne finds herself navigating a new and strange terrain where peace is present but still feels provisional, as though it might dematerialize if she trusts it too completely, and this uneasy armistice with calm becomes the coming chapter of her elaboration, one that requires as important courage as battle ever did, because learning how to live without constant alert means dismembering habits that formerly kept her safe, habits that bruit warnings indeed when there's no peril to justify them. She notices how her body still reacts before her mind can intermediate, how a raised voice in a crowded room can strain her casket, how unanticipated changes to plans spark a shaft of anxiety that feels out of proportion to the moment, and rather than smirching herself for these responses, she begins sluggishly, imperfectly, to treat them as echoes rather than failures, signals from an earlier interpretation of herself who learned survival the hard way and has not yet learned she's no longer trapped. Carter becomes both substantiation and party in this process, learning to fate the difference between moments when Daphne needs consolation and moments when she needs space, understanding that support isn't a fixed script but a responsive, evolving practice, and through trial, mistakes, and honest form, they develop a meter that prioritizes translucency over perfection, choosing to name discomfort rather than bury it beneath politeness or fear of conflict. This openness, though originally unsettling, creates a foundation sturdy enough to hold the weight of Daphne's verity without collapsing under it. And in this participated honesty, their marriage grows quieter but deeper, less concerned with appearances and further invested in authenticity. Daphne's sense of identity continues to expand beyond the confines of survival as she begins to explore what she wants when she's no longer defined by what she escaped, a question that proves both liberating and intimidating because it demands imagination rather than abidance, and she discovers that imagining a future can feel unsafe than enduring a painful present, since stopgap has further to lose. She trials with ambition again, pursuing interests she formerly abandoned because they were inconvenient or hanging to her ex-husband's control, and each reclaimed desire feels like a small act of rebellion against a history that tried to shrink her, buttressing the verity that abuse doesn't simply harm in the moment but attempts to abolish possibility itself. The script treats these exposures with tolerance, allowing Daphne to falter, to mistrustfulness whether she's allowed to want further, to scuffle with guilt for prioritizing herself, and in doing so it honors the complexity of mending, which infrequently follows a clean bow but rather resembles a helical, reconsidering familiar fears from new edge points until their power gradationally diminishes. Carter, observing Daphne's growth, confronts his own internal shifts, fading how fluently he formerly equated love with protection and how that instinct, however well-intentioned, risked reproducing the very dynamics Daphne escaped, and this mindfulness forces him to interrogate his hypotheticals about virility, strength, and cooperation, leading him to purposely relinquish the appetite to manage issues in favor of trusting Daphne's agency. This choice isn't always comfortable, particularly when sweat resurfaces and he longs to shield her from discomfort, but he learns that recognizing her autonomy means believing in her adaptability indeed when he feels helpless, and this assignment reshapes his understanding of closeness as commodity erected through collective respect rather than unilateral immolation. The script allows Carter moments of vulnerability where he admits his fear of failing her, of not being enough to annul the damage done by someone differently. And these admissions come islands rather than burdens, heightening their connection by affirming that love doesn't bear invincibility. As time passes, the specter of Daphne's ex-husband becomes decreasingly abstract, no longer an active antagonist but a reference point for growth, and this shift underscores one of the script's most profound assertions that trauma loses its grip not when it's defeated dramatically but when it's rendered inapplicable through sustained tone description. Daphne no longer frames her opinions around what he might suppose or do.